On what was meant to be the happiest day of her life, something unexpected happened. Her loyal dog stood in her way, and in doing so, silently delivered a message that no one had anticipated. Alice Martins was standing in front of an old full-length mirror in the room where she'd grown up. The elegant ivory gown she'd dreamed about since childhood hugged her figure flawlessly, and her chestnut hair cascaded in soft waves beneath a delicate veil. Everything had been set perfectly for the past 18 months, almost everything. At her feet lay Bruno, her devoted German shepherd, his head resting calmly on his paws and his deep hazel eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was unusual for his typically watchful demeanor. Now 13 years old, Bruno had been by Alice's side through the ups and downs of high school, college, and the early days of adulthood. She had rescued him from a local shelter when he was just an unruly 8-month-old pup in their small town in Connecticut, and in return, he had saved her in countless ways. "What do you think, pal?" Alice whispered, admiring how the delicate lace of her dress caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window. "Is Raphael truly the one?" At the mere mention of her fiancé's name, Bruno's ears perked up slightly, yet he remained still, an odd change from his usual eagerness whenever Raphael was brought up. Raphael, whom Bruno had grown fond of over the last 3 years, usually sent him scampering to her side, but today something felt off. Just then, Alice's mother, Marta, appeared in the doorway. "Honey, the makeup artist is here. Are you ready?" she called. "I'm coming, Mom," Alice replied as she gave herself one final glance in the mirror. Gently, she scratched Bruno behind the ears. "Let's go, buddy. Time to make me a bride." Bruno slowly rose to his feet, his movements a bit labored with age. Although he wasn't as spry as he once was, he remained her most constant companion, a role she'd insisted he play at the wedding, despite her mother's initial doubts. Understanding the deep bond between them, Raphael had agreed without hesitation, even ordering a custom collar adorned with a tiny bow tie for Bruno's big moment. The next couple of hours whirled by in a flurry of activity. The house buzzed with bridesmaids in soft blue dresses, the chatter of hair and makeup artists, and the rhythmic click of Marta's heels as she coordinated with the wedding planner. Throughout the commotion, Bruno stayed close to Alice, noticeably more subdued than usual. "Is he all right?" asked Camila, her maid of honor and lifelong friend, as they gathered their things to head to the church. "He seems off today." Alice frowned and gently ran her hand along Bruno's side. "Maybe he's just overwhelmed by all the excitement. You know he's extra sensitive," she reasoned. Yet, deep down, she suspected it was more than nerves. Bruno had been eating less, moving sluggishly, and spending long hours asleep over the past few days. Although she had planned to visit the vet, the rush of last-minute wedding details had pushed that appointment aside. Marta checked her watch and announced, "The photographer is here, and with traffic likely to be a hassle later, we need to leave now." Nodding, Alice gathered her skirts and said, "Come on, Bruno, let's go." Although the drive to the charming St. Patrick's Church was short, Alice's heart was heavy. It wasn't the normal pre-wedding jitters about marrying Raphael that troubled her. It was Bruno's unusual clinginess during the car ride, with his head resting in her lap, even though he was usually so well-behaved. Arriving at the church an hour early, they found the photographer setting up in the garden. The late September sunlight filtered through autumn leaves, casting a warm, magical glow that matched Alice's hopes for her day. "Let's start with some solo shots of the bride," suggested the photographer as he directed her to stand by a majestic old oak tree. "Then we can bring in the wedding party." Before anyone could react, Bruno, who had been quietly sitting beside Alice's father, Antonio, suddenly sprang up and trotted over. He positioned himself directly in front of Alice, completely blocking the photographer's view. "Bruno, come on," Alice gently urged, attempting to steer him away, but he refused to budge. He wasn't barking or showing aggression. He simply stood there, his body pressed against her legs, gazing up with those soulful eyes. "Bruno, please move," she coaxed softly. Antonio patted his leg. "Maybe he just needs a little walk," Camila suggested, reaching for his leash. But as she approached, Bruno edged even closer to Alice, nearly causing her to stumble. "What's wrong, Bruno?" she murmured, crouching down despite her elegant gown to meet his gaze. It was then that she noticed his breathing was uneven and a tremor ran through his legs, a sign that hadn't been there before. "Might as well finish these photos," Marta interjected with a hint of frustration, reminding her that guests would soon be arriving. But Alice couldn't focus on anything but Bruno, who had now rested his head on her shoulder, a gesture he reserved for moments of discomfort and need. His warmth against her skin was unusual, almost alarming. "Something's not right," she said, her voice trembling. "He's not okay." Camila knelt by Bruno, gently placing her hand on his side. "His heart is racing," observed Antonio, stepping closer with worry etched on his face. "Should we call the vet?" Before anyone could decide, Alice, with shaking hands, pulled out her phone and dialed the number of Dr. Almeida, the veterinarian who had cared for Bruno since the day she rescued him. "Dr. Almeida's emergency line, this is Anna speaking," came the response. "Hello, Anna, this is Alice Martins. Something is terribly wrong with Bruno. He's having difficulty breathing, his heart is pounding, and he's acting very strangely. I need help immediately." After a tense pause, Anna asked, "Aren't you getting married today, Alice?" Her voice wavered. "Yes," she managed to reply. "Please bring him in right away. Dr. Almeida is already at the clinic doing paperwork. He'll see Bruno as soon as possible." As Alice looked around at the small crowd gathered, her parents Antonio and Marta, her friend Camila, the photographer, and even the wedding planner speaking urgently into her headset, her eyes met her father's determined gaze. "Go on, Dad," he said firmly. "I'll inform Raphael. Camila, you can drive her." Antonio continued in his steady tone. "Alice, Bruno has been with you through every heartbreak, every stressful exam, and even the loss of loved ones. He was there when you met Raphael, and he's been by your side through every step. We never abandon family when they need us." Tears welled up as Alice embraced her father tightly. "Thank you, Dad, Mom," she whispered gratefully. In a whirlwind of activity, Camila helped Alice gather her skirts as they hurried to the car, with Bruno trailing slowly at her heels. Meanwhile, Marta immediately took charge, assuring the guests and asking the wedding planner to inform the reception venue of the change in plans. The ride to the veterinary clinic was filled with tension. In the back seat, with her wedding gown fanned out like a fragile shield around her, Alice cradled Bruno's head on her lap while one hand pressed lightly against his chest, monitoring his breaths, and the other smoothed his graying fur. "Remember how rambunctious he was when you first brought him home?" Camila tried to lighten the mood. Despite the worry, a slight smile broke through Alice's distress. "He once chewed up my favorite sneakers, my mother's gardening gloves, and that hideous hat my aunt gave me at Christmas, the one with the plastic fruit decorations." Camila chuckled softly. He did you a favor there." They reached the clinic in record time. Dr. Almeida greeted them at the door, his eyes widening momentarily at the sight of Alice still in her wedding dress, but he said nothing as he guided Bruno inside. The examination felt endless. Alice paced the cramped room as her gown whispered around her with every step, while Camila sat quietly, occasionally checking her phone for updates. Finally, Dr. Almeida returned with a somber expression. "Alice, please sit down," he said gently, words no pet owner ever wants to hear. With Camila's immediate help, Alice sank into a chair. "Bruno has developed a cardiac condition," Dr. Almeida explained. "Based on our tests, he's in the early stages of heart failure. The stress and excitement today have likely aggravated his condition. He was fine just days ago, but these illnesses can escalate quickly in older dogs. At 13 years, he's already surpassed the typical lifespan for his breed. Bruno was trying to tell you something all along. By refusing to let you walk away, he was signaling that he needed help." Alice's voice faltered as tears began to fall. "So, he was warning me?"
Dr. Almeida nodded.
Animals have an incredible intuition. He recognized that he needed medical assistance, and he trusts you implicitly. "We can start him on medication right now to manage his symptoms and keep him comfortable, but I must be honest, given his age and the seriousness of his condition, we might be talking about months rather than years." Overwhelmed by emotion, Alice's tears finally spilled freely. Camila squeezed her hand in support. "I must stay by his side," Alice declared firmly. "Listen," Camila began gently. "When you took Bruno in, you made him a promise that he'd never be alone when he needed you most. And you've always kept that promise." Looking from her wedding dress to Dr. Almeida, Alice said, "Please, start the treatment right now." The next hour was a blur as Dr. Almeida administered the first round of medication while explaining the treatment plan in detail. Sitting on the floor beside Bruno's bed with her gown spread protectively around her, Alice listened intently, even taking notes on her phone. Outside, life continued its relentless pace. Camila coordinated with Antonio, Marta, and Raphael's family. The guests waiting at the church were informed of a family emergency, and the reception was postponed, and a text from Raphael flashed on Alice's phone asking, "How is he?" With trembling fingers, she replied, "Not well. Heart failure." "I'm so sorry about the wedding." After a brief pause, his next message read, "Don't apologize. I'm on my way." Within 20 minutes, the clinic door opened and Rafael Oliveira entered in his tuxedo, trailed closely by his best man, Mateus. Seeing Alice, her makeup streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, and her wedding dress creased beyond recognition, Raphael's heart ached. "I'm so sorry," Alice began, but Raphael quickly crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "Hey," he murmured softly as he wiped away a tear. "Remember when I proposed and told you that I married you for your incredibly generous heart? For loving so deeply without reservation? I could never be angry with you for standing by him." Fresh tears cascaded down Alice's face as she leaned into Raphael's comforting embrace. "The wedding can wait," Raphael said with quiet determination. "The venue, the schedule, all of that pales in comparison to what really matters, being together." He reached over to scratch behind Bruno's ears, and the old dog's tail gave a weak, appreciative thump against the floor. Mateus chimed in, "We might have an alternative plan." Camila's eyes lit up as she confirmed, "We've made some calls already." The minister had offered to perform the ceremony right there at the clinic, and with both families on board, they could marry in a small, intimate setting. Alice glanced around the room and then down at Bruno, whose loving gaze had been with her for over a decade. "Only if you truly want it," Raphael added softly. "We can also postpone everything." "No," Alice interrupted, a bittersweet smile forming on her lips. "This is exactly how it should be. Bruno has been there for every milestone, when we met at the park, on our first date, and when you proposed. He deserves to be here for this moment too." And so, just 2 hours later, Alice Martins and Rafael Oliveira exchanged vows in the waiting room of the Riverside Veterinary Clinic. Alice's dress was rumpled, her makeup hurriedly touched up by Camila, and her hair fell in natural, unstyled waves around her shoulders, while Raphael's tuxedo bore the marks of an emotional day. Their immediate families, the minister, Camila, and Mateus, were the only guests. Bruno, sporting his custom bow tie collar and a makeshift bandage on his leg, lay contentedly at their feet as they vowed to share a life of love. Dr. Almeida and his staff stood quietly at the doorway, discreetly wiping away tears as the minister pronounced them husband and wife. When Raphael kissed Alice, Bruno lifted his head just enough to emit a soft, approving bark, prompting laughter and tears all around. That evening, instead of a grand reception, Alice and Raphael settled on the floor of their apartment with Bruno nestled between them, sharing takeout Chinese food while still in their wedding attire. They took turns offering him small bites of plain chicken, a meal Dr. Almeida had approved. "When I first met you both at the park," Raphael remarked, watching as Bruno delicately accepted a morsel from Alice's finger, "I knew Bruno was part of the deal. I never imagined he'd end up teaching me so much about unconditional love." Alice looked at her new husband with curious wonder. "What do you mean?" "Look at today," Raphael explained. "You planned the perfect wedding down to every detail. But the moment Bruno needed you, you didn't hesitate at all. That's true love, the kind that isn't measured by costs or plans, but by being present when it matters most." Before Raphael could continue, Alice leaned in for a tender kiss, careful not to disturb Bruno, who had already dozed off between them. "When did you become so wise?" she asked softly. "I learned from the best," Raphael replied with a gentle smile, nodding toward Bruno. "He's been our greatest teacher on how to love without limits." In the following months, life took on a bittersweet rhythm. Bruno had his moments of strength and weakness. The medication offered some relief, but nothing could stop the inevitable progression of his condition. Alice and Raphael reshaped their daily routines around Bruno's needs, taking turns staying home when he felt too weak, celebrating the good days with short walks in the park where their love first bloomed, and comforting him on the harder days. Through it all, Bruno's gentle, loving spirit shone through. He still greeted them at the door, albeit with a slow tail wag instead of his once exuberant jumps, and he continued to insist on sleeping by their bed. Even as his eyes grew dimmer, his love spoke volumes in countless small ways. One quiet evening in early spring, almost 6 months after the wedding, Bruno signaled that he had enjoyed a good day. He had eaten well, soaked in some sunshine in the backyard, and even played softly with his favorite toy. Yet as night fell, he became restless, drifting from Alice to Raphael, as if ensuring that both were by his side. Worried, they called Dr. Almeida, who arrived at their living room, where Bruno's head rested in Alice's lap and Raphael's steady hand stroked his back. It was in that moment they said their final farewell to the loyal friend who had given them so much. "Thank you, Bruno," Alice whispered against his fur as he peacefully slipped away. "Thank you for protecting me, for being my friend, for guiding me to Raphael, and for teaching us what love truly means, and thank you for choosing me all those years ago at the shelter." Later that night, as they reviewed photos from their unconventional wedding day, Alice's eyes lingered on one particular picture taken by Camila, a snapshot where neither she nor Raphael was looking at each other or the minister, but instead both were gazing lovingly at Bruno. "He understood," Alice murmured, tracing Bruno's image on the screen with her finger. "That day, when he wouldn't let me walk down the aisle, he was telling us he was running out of time and that we needed to focus on what really matters." Raphael wrapped his arms around her. He was right. Our day wasn't flawless by traditional standards, but it was perfect for us because of Bruno. Our marriage began with love, commitment, and the promise to always be there for one another. A year later, Alice and Raphael found themselves standing outside the Riverside Animal Shelter, the very place where Alice had first found Bruno 13 years ago. After months of mourning their beloved companion, they felt ready to open their hearts once more. "Are you sure about this?" Raphael asked softly, squeezing Alice's hand. With a determined nod, Alice touched the small locket around her neck that held Bruno's photo. "He taught us so much about love. The best way to honor his memory is by sharing that love with another dog who needs a home." Inside, the familiar scents and sounds of the shelter welcomed them. As they strolled past the kennels, Alice remembered the day she first laid eyes on Bruno, a timid, skinny German Shepherd pup whose soulful eyes had captured her heart. They paused at the very last kennel, where a senior golden retriever lay on a well-worn blanket. Gray around his muzzle and watching them with kind, brown eyes, the name tag read, "Duke, age 10. "Most people prefer puppies or young dogs," explained the shelter attendant. "But Duke has been here for 3 months ever since his family had to surrender him when they moved into a care facility. He's as sweet as they come, though his age sometimes deters potential adopters." Alice knelt by the kennel door. Duke lifted his head, slowly getting to his feet, and ambled over to her, pressing his nose against her hand. "He does have arthritis in his hind legs," the worker added, "and he'll need medication along with shorter walks. But he's perfect." "Perfect," Alice echoed, glancing at Raphael with tears glistening in her eyes. Raphael nodded, understanding the unspoken promise they'd made to Bruno. That very evening, Duke settled into their home as if he'd always belonged there. He claimed Bruno's old bed by the fireplace, even though they had purchased a new one, and seemed to honor the memory of the friend who once occupied that special spot. Snuggled together on the couch while Duke slept peacefully in Bruno's former place, Alice remarked, "Some thought we were crazy for adopting a senior dog, knowing our time with him would be shorter. Raphael smiled and pulled her closer. But we learned from Bruno that it's not about how long we have, but how deeply we love. He showed us that sometimes the most beautiful love stories don't follow a perfect plan. Alice rested her head on his shoulder as Duke softly twitched his paws in his sleep. Bruno's final gift wasn't just about our wedding day. It was teaching us that love is worth every sacrifice and every heartache. Because of him, we can now open our hearts to Duke, even if our time together might be all too brief. Raphael nodded toward Duke, who had just awakened and was gazing at them with a look of pure contentment. He's helping us continue Bruno's legacy of love. That night, as they prepared for bed, Duke trotted upstairs and curled up in the same spot where Bruno once slept, right beside Alice. As she drifted off, Alice could almost feel the presence of two souls watching over her. One tangible, and one a cherished memory etched forever in her heart. Years later, when Alice and Raphael recounted the story of their wedding day to their children, it wasn't a tale of things going awry. It was a lesson in love, loyalty, and the true priorities in life. They showed their children that poignant photo from the clinic, the one where both bride and groom were looking down at Bruno and EXP. Learned that sometimes the most precious moments come in unexpected packages. They vowed to live out the kind of unconditional, unwavering love that Bruno had taught them, always putting what truly matters above any carefully laid plans. In the living room, right next to their wedding picture, they hung a modest plaque that read, "Sometimes, love means changing your perfect plans. Perfection isn't in the path we plan to take, but in the hearts that guide us home." Below the inscription, Bruno's little bow tie collar hung alongside Duke's tag, a lasting symbol of a heart's endless capacity to love, learn, and grow despite loss and change. Every anniversary, instead of hosting lavish celebrations, Alice and Raphael would visit the animal shelter, bringing donations and spending time with other older dogs like Duke, reminders that love is meant to be shared, no matter how unexpectedly it arrives or how short the time together might be.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.